Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, the keynote speech for the second day, concluding, is by Dirk Moses, a very distinguished scholar. We're very lucky to have him with us from the University of North Carolina. Thank you, Dirk.
Thanks very much for the introduction. We're just getting the tech ready and it's there. Terrific to be here with you. It's an honor, in fact, and I was very pleased to come in week 3 of semester and teach my classes online and late in the evening and spend the days with you here talking about this very important subject about which I've learned a lot thanks to the quite unprecedented assembly of experts here. Now, I think the first thing that needs to be said is an acknowledgement of Jo and all the work she's done in pulling together this conference. Not only does it take incredible passion, it's also quite risky in many ways, as we all know. It involves considerable vision and energy, and I don't think any of us, even those of us who've organised conferences of this scale, can appreciate what she's had to contend with in terms of international travel during a pandemic, or the considerable tech challenges of live streaming it while half the people are zooming in and so forth. So I think an acknowledgement to Jo and her intrepid team is in order. Yeah. And not for nothing was there a write-up in the Washington Post yesterday. I mean, how often do conferences in the UK, or anywhere really for that matter, get a write-up in a major newspaper like that? Now, I had a text prepared some time ago, but I threw most of it out as I was listening to the papers, and I thought, since I get the last word, I'll try to respond to the mood of the conference, to the line of questioning that I'm seeing, and see if I can add something. Now, I'm an historian and not a politician nor a political scientist, still less an activist. Some of you may find the kind of historical knowledge that I offer as an historian useless or worse. Be that as it may, my job as an historian, I feel, is to explain how and why we are confronted with the challenges and problems we face today. Historians delineate dilemmas rather than propose answers. So please don't go looking for answers in my paper today. A historical lesson may be that there are no satisfactory answers when powerful and paranoid states securitize population groups as threats and seek to neutralize them. Another lesson is that academics like me approach issues like genocide in a very different way than political practitioners. I'm not a sinologist, still less a Xinjiang specialist, so I won't be talking much about what's going on there. We've learned a lot about the situation from the experts that Jo's assembled. What I can offer are reflections about the deep structure of something that I can empirically reconstruct on the basis of archival and other research. How states and non-state actors define and contest humanitarian emergencies, not ones caused by natural disasters like floods and earthquakes, but those caused by states and company states, like the East India Company in the late 18th century. Now, European history is replete with scandals about such humanitarian emergencies, which were conducted in the idiom of what I call the language of transgression. And we'll click here, a bit of self-promotion to my book, and you can see the subtitle is Permanent Security in the Language of Transgression. The language of transgression is the idiom of that which shocks the conscience of mankind, to use the old-fashioned term of art that appears in surprisingly many international treaties, and that's been used at this conference. As I argue in this book, this language of shocking, of conscience, of humanity can be traced to the internal theological critiques of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. For example, in Las Casas's short history of the conquest from the middle of the 16th century, which was accompanied by these kinds of images, atrocity images, which established a style of and a language of presenting mass atrocity crimes, as we call them today, already 500 or 600 years ago. Now, what we are doing in this room over the last few days, in other words, is not new. People have been engaged in advocacy against atrocities like this, of various sorts, for hundreds of years, and they've been using a remarkably stable set of images and words to discuss them, like shocking the conscience of mankind or humanity. Now, an historical approach, at least for me, is uninterested in cataloguing and accounting for cases of genocide. Still less, well, cataloguing, we do want to account for them, but cataloguing cases of genocide, still less in assessing the compliance of states with the UN Genocide Convention. I know a lot of you are engaged in that analytical operation here, but that's not what I'm doing. Instead of taking the law and concept of genocide for granted as a stable category reflecting intended ethno-national group destruction, an historical approach examines the generative effect of this ideal typical definition. In other words, I don't presume genocide is a real thing in the sense of a stable historical phenomenon. Of course, the acts and violence and the trauma and exploitation we've been discussing and we've heard from witnesses is obviously real, and there's no denying that. But categorizing them as one thing or another is not a matter of a stable historical reality. As we'll see in a few examples that I'll discuss from the late 60s and early 70s, Biafra and East Pakistan, and particularly the British policy, the genocide concept is an ideal type that enables the identification of supposed instances of a stable phenomenon in history, thereby giving the illusion of objectivity and continuity to what are in fact arbitrary conceptual choices made in the present. Accordingly, the construction of this ideal type and the contestation about its application, which is what we've been doing here, constitutes the key dramas in what I call the diplomacy of genocide, which is the title of my paper. Now, these dramas are diplomatic in two senses. They pertain to international relations and they entail intense negotiations by many actors. They are, first, these actors, the victim groups or those that speak for them, often diasporic situations, who make bids for recognition and external humanitarian intervention. And second, the alleged perpetrator states that disavow accusations of genocide, the states that level and endorse such accusations, and bystander states that seek a political solution to the conflict. Then thirdly, you've got civil society and media actors that try to shape public opinion to pressure states and the UN to do something about the violence against civilians. Historical analysis proceeds from the ground up by reconstructing the patterns of interactions between these actors, the victims, the perpetrator states, and then civil society actors. The diplomacy of genocide, then, comprises the intranational and international interactions between state and non-state actors about genocide, in particular how to categorize and memorialize mass violence, and how to assess the merits of intervention to prevent or stop it. Now, before the concept of genocide was invented in 1944, such questions pertained to atrocities. That was the language that was used largely, ranging in type from the Belgian King Leopold's labor exploitation of Africans in the Congo to the massacres and deportations of Armenians by Ottoman authorities during the First World War. The scale and destruction in World War II revealed the limitations of the diplomacy of atrocity, if you like, and led to the UN Genocide Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide in 1948. But despite the lofty rhetoric accompanying the convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the same time, that many heralded as manifesting the progressive potential of modernity after its darkest moments, civilians were not, in fact, comprehensively protected from mass violence. For the UN Charter, the Genocide Convention and the subsequent evolution of Holocaust memory built two paradoxical features into the new diplomacy of genocide, and they are these: the expansion of humanitarian sensitivity in the stigmatization of genocide I think we can see that, it was accompanied by a contraction of the humanitarian imagination due to the immense symbolic aura of genocide's archetype, the Holocaust, which set an impossibly high analogical bar. And two, the stimulation of intervention constituencies, some of whom are here, invoking the Holocaust analogy, and eventually the R2P norm, which ran into the UN Charter's hardening of state sovereignty, namely the general prohibition on intervention in other states. Now, historical reconstructions reveal that the bone of contention in naming genocide and advocating intervention is whether the contested violence falls into one or of two artificial but enduring and widely deployed categories. On the one hand, the non-political, which is the first one, if you like, the non-political category of ethno-national racial conflict in which civilians are attacked solely because of their identity, implying their lack of agency and thus innocence. Or the political category, which is the bottom one, in which some of their number did engage in some kind of political violence, which implied their agency and thus the collective guilt. Now, the innocent victim is intrinsic to the imagination of criminality that shocks the conscience of mankind. This is all in the book, by the way. So if you're taking intense notes, it's easier just to read the book. Now, where it's laid out in much more detail. Now, the innocent victim is intrinsic to the imagination of criminality that shocks the conscience of mankind. And this is the threshold that genocide came to represent in the Genocide Convention, when, as we'll see, state representatives in the UN made the Holocaust the archetype for the crime of crimes. Now, here's a classic example. Okay, there's Deborah Lipstadt, who's now the US President Biden's anti-Semitism commissioner. So she says the Holocaust was something entirely different from genocide, she means. It was an organized program with the goal of wiping out a specific people. Jews did not have to do anything to be perceived as worthy of being murdered. Old people who had to be wheeled out to the deportation trains, and babies who had to be carried were all to be killed. The point was not, as in occupied countries, to get rid of people because they might mount a resistance to Nazism, but to get rid of Jews because they were Jews. Now, this is the elemental distinction in Holocaust and genocide studies, and I think in popular perceptions of these things. Okay. So what states do is they say, we're not attacking the Rohingya or the Uyghurs because they're Uyghurs or Rohingya. We have no problem with their identity. We are suppressing an insurgency, even if it's only some of their number. Okay, and so therefore it's a political an act of political security and legitimate, and not for foreign states to comment on. Now, this dichotomy between unpolitical and political violence is empirically misleading because political logics govern any extensive civilian destruction. But the diplomacy of genocide structures discourse about it in these stark terms. By those terms, victim groups tend to promote the non-political understanding of state conduct to gain attention and possible intervention. In other words, to seem like Jews were in the Holocaust. Unpolitical, agentless. While the accused states respond that legitimate security, political imperatives drive policy. Now, what I want to show with you now, I'll skip a couple of things, is a quotation from the British Foreign Office from 1895, where you can see they're wrestling with this. It's a really very astute commentary on the way the Ottoman authorities were handling the existence of some Armenian terrorists, but was used as a pretext by Ottoman authorities to engage in extensive massacres in the mid-1890s. I'll read it out. So this is one of the internal memos. This is one of the wonderful things about archival research. This is from the National Archives in Kew. You can see the reference, the archive reference at the bottom. The view held at numerous meetings in England on behalf of the Armenians is that they were suffering solely on account of their religion. So that's the unpolitical definition, right? And that's not correct, at all events in the first instance. The actions of the Turkish government was undoubtedly directed against a political movement which was promoted by certain agitators and a secret propaganda, though the nature and importance of the movement may have been greatly exaggerated. The measures taken by the local authorities and the attitude of the Muslim population were in no doubt too frequently dictated by religious antipathy, which intensified, though it had not originated the evil. So you can see they're wrestling with the tension or the distinction between, is this politically or religiously motivated violence? And what was the role of the victims here, or at least some of the victims, right? And I think they've reasoned through it here very well. Yes, there were some Armenian nationalist organizations. They'd robbed some banks and were trying to provoke a foreign intervention, frankly. But this was then taken as an excuse by local and regional Ottoman authorities to engage in mass massacres. Hundreds of thousands of people who were clearly had nothing to do with these terrorist acts, but were held guilty by association. Now, is this, for the Uyghur experts here, is this the dynamic we're seeing in Xinjiang, anyway? I'm going to move now just to commentating on PowerPoints. Now, this civil war or insurgency dichotomy versus genocide, which I think is artificial, but does structure the way we talk and think about genocide, came up in many instances during the 20th century. We're going to talk about the Biafra and East Pakistan case. You see it very much in the debate about the Rohingya in Myanmar, where the Myanmar military says, and even a commission of inquiry they instituted, a complete whitewash, where they say, well, there were some attacks on police stations by Rohingya separatists. And they take that as a license to deport virtually the entire Rohingya population. And I will call that an act of permanent security at the end of my paper, because the logic is never, by removing the entire population, never again will you have a potential terrorist problem. But you can see the disproportionate nature is very much in terms of consistent with that quotation from the British Foreign Office. Okay. Now, the distortion of the genocide optic, for example, in the way we talked about Syria, was that there was intensive attention on the fate of the Yazidis because it was easily discernible under the genocide optic, and genocide might be the right word, right? But the fact is that many more Muslims were killed in this civil war. So if you're interested in civilian protection, then the genocide optic gets in the way, rather than looking at terms of security more generally. So let's look at these two cases, and I'm going to focus very much on the British angle because of where we are, to see how this confusion between a political and non-political crime plays out in the diplomacy of genocide, and how the term genocide becomes a political football and a political problem for the governments that they try to wish away and argue away and to dissemble. And we'll ask ourselves, you can ask yourselves, is that what's going on now with the British government in relation to the Uyghurs? So first, though, let's briefly recap what the genocide concept comes from. So here's Raphael Lemkin. He comes up with this concept in 1944 in this book, Axis, Rule in Occupied Europe. And it's a very broad definition. In the first should be included every action infringing upon the life, liberty, health, corporal integrity, economic existence, and the honor of which the inhabitants, when committed because they belong to a national, racial, religious, or racial group. And in the second, every policy aiming at the destruction or aggrandizement of such group to the prejudice and detriment of another. Now, that does not become law in the end. Okay. But while it's being negotiated at the UN, it becomes a diplomatic football. So here are articles, actually slightly after the convention, but here are articles in the New York Times. For example, you have here Israel raises the issue of genocide against Arab states and against Pakistan for what is going on in Pakistan about its minority Jewish population. At the same time, Baltic exile groups are accusing the Soviets of genocide. Here's 1947 for its occupation of the Baltic states. I mean, this is just a small example of the way it becomes a diplomatic football during the Cold War and in the Middle East, right? And then in America itself, a communist black group run by William Patterson penned this quite large account called We Charge Genocide, several hundred pages, which is an account of the effects of Jim Crow, lynchings and so forth, but other types of violence and systematic disadvantage of the black population, which they tried to bring to the UN. And at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Paul Robeson preventing the recharge genocide to the UN Secretariat. They were all intercepted at various points by American authorities and deported and rounded up. But you can see it becomes an international diplomatic issue that makes states extremely nervous. And here we have just another newspaper example. Now, to give you a sense of how confusing it was for people about what actually is genocide, and before the intensity or consciousness of the Holocaust as a separate issue that we have now, I was talking about the 1950s, here we have the World Jewish Congress saying that, arguing now for a narrowing of the definition. The World Jewish Congress has held that genocide was a non-political crime, one which was not necessarily connected with a struggle of states for predominance or influence. It involved inhuman acts against groups which the other stronger groups sought to eliminate, not for political reasons, but for racial, religious, or similar reasons. As if that's a natural distinction, when I think it's highly artificial. Okay. Now, let's skip now to the Biafra War from 1966 to 1970. I don't know if any of you know much about it, but Biafra was a self-proclaimed republic in the southwest of Nigeria, where predominantly Christian Igbo people lived, and for various reasons, having to do with some terrible massacres in the north in 1966, sought to secede. And that led to a military struggle over these years in which Her Majesty's government backed the federal military government against the secession. Okay. There were important British oil interests there and so forth. Now, the purpose of me showing you these images is also give you an extent of to give you an idea of the extent of the public protest here and in Germany. And we could go to France as well, but we run out of time. It's much more intense than the Uyghurs today. And yet, British policy was not moved one iota. Now, in this case, of course, it's a former British colony. There are direct British economic interests, slightly different to what's happening in China. But I want you to bear this in mind, that the kind of work many of us are involved in here is not new in terms of the diplomacy of genocide, the public advocacy and so forth. Here we have Biafran diaspora activism marching to from the Soviet embassy to 10 Downing Street to protest British arms sales to Nigeria. Now in Germany, stop the genocide in Biafra. Back in Germany, here you have Biafran and German students who walked from Bonn, I think from Frankfurt, from the university for recognition. And the Igbo were a Christian people, and so this featured much in their protest. Here we have them again, moving from, and it says at the bottom, silence to the murder, 1969. So Völkermord is genocide. So the language of genocide is central to this. Here we have as well, and notice the Nazi imagery in the middle. So that's in Hamburg in 1968. Now back in Britain, you have intense civilian mobilization. Here are documents that I've photographed from the archives. You have Christmas Biafra vigils from London to Rome, and intellectuals. Back in Germany, you have Günter Grass talking about it. Important British writer, Frederick Forsyth, wrote a very well-known book about it in 1969, and then last year wrote an article in The Guardian, on his anniversary, which was very critical of British policy, and he used the word genocide. Likewise, Oberon War did in a series of articles and a book, Britain's Shame. And There in Piccadilly Circus, you have Jean Shrimpton, some of you are old enough to remember, a very, very well-known model at the time, with quite a fabulous coat, was engaging with others, like a well-known actor, on Biafra Christmas vigils and activism. Okay? And this was all reported in the press. Okay? Christian mobilization in Germany. At the bottom it says, justice for Biafra. Okay? And because there were many Irish missionaries in Biafra, there was intense Irish engagement here. So here we have the Holy Ghost missionaries and Biafran children pose for a photo promoting the Evening Herald's fundraising campaign. Because there was there was a blockade in the end of Biafra, and possibly 2 million Biafrans died of starvation, and the starvation became the main issue in the publicity. But in the publicity war, and but in addition to the genocide allegation, so raising money for food deliveries became central to the advocacy. In Germany, there were the inevitable Holocaust imageries. Now, was this genocide? People were wondering. So here we have the confusion from a French Red Cross worker. It is mostly when speaking about the victims of this war that we speak about genocide. But genocide? No, if it is used in the same sense of the cold-blooded extermination executed like the Nazis. Yes, if we look to the sequence of events, the particular circumstances of the blockade, and perhaps the difficulties experienced through a lack of control of troops or overzealous leaders or mercenaries. Actually, that doesn't look very much like the Holocaust, but he's right. But is that also genocide? You can just see there's general confusion. Now, what happened in the end is the United Nations sent an investigator team in with the permission of the Nigerian federal military government, but they weren't allowed to move into Biafran territory. They had to, they were highly chaperoned, and miraculously they concluded it was not genocide. Okay, and that basically ended the campaign for the on the Biafran side, and that was the end of it. And various commentators said, well, in the end, it doesn't really look like the Holocaust, because when there was a Biafran defeat and surrender in January 1970, there was a rhetoric of reconciliation, integration, which didn't really occur. But observers said, well, that doesn't look like a genocide. It looks like the ending of a civil war with a large blockade. Yes, millions of people died, but that wasn't even really illegal at the time. It's before the additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions. And that was the end of it. And as a result, Biafra never became part of genocide studies, although at the time, many, many people were convinced this was kind of a new Holocaust. But because the Holocaust imagery, by then, after the Eichmann trial and so forth, had become so ubiquitous in public consciousness, there was an attempt to analogize, right? But it always fails, because in the end, it was a civil war in a post-colonial African state and bore very little resemblance to the Holocaust, right? But it's a trap. It's a discursive game whose rules are a conspiracy against groups like the Biafrans or the Uyghurs, mind you, in which they'll usually lose, because it's very difficult to analogize with the Holocaust. Now let's look at East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh in 1971. You can see the green on the right. So that was part of Pakistan until 1971. There was a secessionist civil war, much like Biafra, but in this case it succeeded, in part because India invaded at the end of 1971 and defeated the Pakistani army in the field, and then it becomes Bangladesh. Now, there too were also mass demonstrations in London of the kind that I don't see with the Uyghurs. Just to give you a sense of the intensity of civil society mobilization. If anything, it's decreased over the years rather than increased. Okay. Of course, you had a large Bengali population in London, and MPs who were the MPs of their constituency. So you had questions in Parliament and considerable pressure, as well as media support. So here's a Pakistani journalist, Anthony Mascarenhas, who changed sides. He was so appalled by what he saw from the Pakistan army that he left. He got to the UK, convinced the editors at the Sunday Times of what was going on, and they allowed him to publish these hair-raising articles. Once again, I don't think we've seen this level of prominence given to the Uyghur case in the press. There have been some articles in The Guardian and so forth, but not like this one. This was a real sustained campaign by the Sunday Times, and there were also other British journalists who wrote quite a lot about this. And you had local civil society. You had Bangladesh Action Committee in Great Britain. And there's hundreds and hundreds of pages like this in the archives if you're willing to go digging. These are from the UN archives in Geneva. So you have the Bangladesh Women's Association of Great Britain, May 1971, handwritten letter to the Prime Minister. Okay, right, and then so here you have an internal memo. So these are the British documents. I attach a draft reply to Mr. Simcock at number 10 to his letter of the 12th, enclosing a copy of the letter received from the Bangladesh Women's Association. And how to respond. It would not in any case be right for any minister to receive any representative from them, since we do not recognise the state, and there seemed to be no good reason why any minister should find the time to see representatives of this association at all. Okay. Now, this is not for public consumption. Right? This is like internal British bureaucratic machinations where you see the diplomacy of genocide in action, right? There's a genocide allegation out there, these civil society groups, they're writing to the Prime Minister, there will be questions in Parliament. How do we respond to this? Like, do you see here and in other documents, like this question in Parliament, a sincere appreciation of the humanitarian issues by the government? No. And nor would I say the British government here is untypical. This would be the same, this occurs with any state. So here's a question in Parliament. Has the British government made any representations of the government of Pakistan about the situation in East Pakistan? We have been in close contact or close touch with the Pakistan government through our High Commission in Islamabad and with the local authorities in Dhaka through our High Commission, Deputy High Commission. We deplore the tragic loss of life in East Pakistan from whatever cause. We earnestly hope that the forces involved will exercise all possible restraint and that political discussions can be resumed at the earliest possible moment. But I've been stated this is a matter as I've said, this is a matter for the government of Pakistan. Now, this is after these articles about genocide. This is how they handle it. Okay. Now, let's move to a different part of the paper. Let's talk about how historians approach these kinds of issues that come up, like in Bangladesh, Pakistan, or the Uyghurs, right? Looking back historically, I would say what we're seeing here is state building via violent assimilation, deportations, executions, or exile or incarceration of community leaders, suppression of cultural institutions, and forced labor, and so forth. This has been seen I've seen this as quite typical over the last 200 or 300 years in modern state building. Let's think about the Russian expansion into the Caucasus. How many of you know what happened to the Circassians from the 1840s, 50s, and 1860s? Right? Now, these processes were known as Russification for the case of the Russians, or Polonization, especially of border areas when Poland became an independent nation state after the First World War, because about a third of its population were non-ethnic Poles, of Germans, Jews, Ukrainians, who were seen as security threats, especially on border areas. Sound familiar? Now, post-colonial states are doing the same. And as Mark Levine pointed out yesterday, they're engaging in a process of state development catch-up, which means it's often quite, it compresses time. You know, that which took hundreds of years in France, in Britain, and so forth, is compressed into decades with the consequent human rights atrocities, you know, which can't be denied. Why is it that the Communist Party is paranoid about its border areas? You know, many of you have heard the slogan of the century of humiliation. Now, it's often mobilized somewhat wantonly, but there's no doubt that it's intensely and keenly felt by Chinese elites. And I think Britain is at the center of the century of humiliation. It begins with the Opium Wars. Okay. Now, as many papers have pointed out, many of the policies and practices that we've been hearing about over the last few days do resemble settler colonialism. I think that's indisputable. But they also resemble other forms of colonialism, like plantation colonialism, about labor exploitation. Because settler colonialism is not interested in labor exploitation. It's about replacing one set of people with another and displacing them. Okay? It looks like there are both logics going on in this case. Okay? Now, in other words, China is doing in many ways which other states have done long ago. In the meantime, though, we have conventions against it. I'm not justifying, of course, anything that's going on in China. I'm just looking at this historically. No? Another point I think that historians observe is that powerful states don't intervene against each other when those atrocities are going on within their own borders, and they protect each other's clients from intervention. Okay? Many of you have mentioned the Chinese protection of the Myanmar state. Now, which states, Western states, covering for their human rights abuses? Well, I won't mention any now, but you can figure them out for yourself. But this is just how international relations works, and the language of genocide in the diplomacy of genocide is used to condemn, to morally ostracize the excesses that your enemies or your rivals' clients are engaged in, or that your rivals are engaged in. Okay? And then this is played out in the Security Council. So this is how genocide becomes a diplomatic problem rather than really an authentic humanitarian problem. Now, let's move to the legal understanding, okay, which is alien to me as a non-lawyer, but is the game that states need to play because we have international laws on these things now. Now, first, back to Lemkin. Lemkin was inclined to see all these things we've mentioned, like this Russification, polonization, these kind of processes. He did see those as part of a genocidal process. He used what I've found in the archives as a one long chain argument. And he took that from the Polish government in exile during the Second World War, when they identified a concerted, long-term, highly articulated attempt by the Nazi state to destroy the Polish nation. And that meant you linked, say, the removal of citizenship of Poles who were in the German general government, which had been annexed, and in other words, taking their citizenship away, was part of a process of the destruction of the Polish nation, which ended with massacres and the incarceration of Poles in Auschwitz and other camps, right? So they're linked. So although one is obviously non-violent, just changing someone's citizenship, in some ways completely different from massacres, the Polish government linked them as part of a process, and Lemkin adopted that, okay? And what the genocide concept was designed to do by Lemkin was to bridge these experiences between Christian Europeans, what the Nazis did to the Poles, the Czechoslovaks, and so forth, and the Jews in a bridging concept. Although their experiences, despite having many points of contact, were also quite distinct. I mean, Jews were to be exterminated in their entirety, and that wasn't the aim with ethnic Poles. Yeah, but they were needed for slave labor and so forth. Okay, so hence the incoherence in the genocide concept, because it includes crippling, which is a term Lemkin did use, and extermination. But crippling and extermination are different things. But he included them in the genocide concept in order to draw attention to the plight of Jews, because when he wrote this book in 1942 and 1943, the Allies were not interested that much in what was happening to Jews in Europe, because they regarded, and this is where you need an historical sensibility, you go back and read the documents, they regarded the Nazi state as a pagan, anti-Christian movement, above all. I mean, there was an anti-Semitic culture in Western Europe as well, let alone East Central Europe. Okay? Yes, Jews were getting it as well, but they were a tiny minority. The occupied states were Christian states, overwhelmingly. And look what they're doing to Christian Poles, Christian Czechoslovaks, Christian Belgians, right? They're destroying their civilization. And Jews was kind of folded in there once you read these books that were produced at the time by the Polish government in exile, the Czechoslovak government in exile. So Lemkin was using this concept to draw attention, Christian attention, if you like, to the Jewish experience. By accident, almost, it becomes something that figures in the United Nations Convention. We can't get into that. Now, what happens, though, in that process of codification is that it omits many parts of that chain that Lemkin had included. It omits cultural genocide. It omits ethnic cleansing, a term they didn't use, population expulsion. It omits political groups as a possible targeted group, and the political motivations as a grounds for persecuting or killing someone. In other words, it omits many of the action states used historically in this state-building process I mentioned before. Now, that is not an accident. You go back and read the 2,000 pages of deliberations in the United Nations committees, which have been conveniently collected in 2 volumes by legal scholars, and you can see that states state quite openly, we can't have a political group as a protected group. These were right-wing Latin American states, because we have these communists, and we want to be able to neutralize them without being accused of genocide. Likewise, they say, we can't have cultural genocide, the British as well, because, you know, we don't want to be accused of genocide in our colonies. And large states like Brazil that had indigenous minorities were very worried that assimilation practices, which were considered progressive at the time, would be captured by cultural genocide. So it was removed. In other words, states redefined genocide from the very broad definition that Lemkin had to an extremely narrow one in order to protect their sovereignty, in order to ensure that they could engage in reprisals or neutralize security threats, and to engage in the kind of state-building processes that all states had been engaged in over the centuries. So genocide effectively becomes a synonym for the Holocaust. Okay? And that's why it's fixated on biology, biological extinction, those 5 elements in Article 2. Now, I'll finish with this. My alternative to get out of these or beyond these conceptual and legal dilemmas is somewhat utopian idea of replacing genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, which are these atrocity crimes that the UN has now bundled and has a special rapporteur for, with this concept of permanent security, which is a striving of states and armed groups who seek to found states to make themselves permanently invulnerable to threats. It's an excessive, often paranoid policy response that necessarily results in civilian casualties, which I'm interested in, by striving for the unobtainable goal of absolute security. Not just security that you have treaties with your neighbors, but dominating your own political space and your neighbors, and supply chains, resource supply chains, so that you become autarkic almost. Okay. Now, in the book, I go into some detail about 2 modalities of this. One is illiberal. This is becoming a little academic probably for a lot of you, but it's important to mention. Illiberal and liberal permanent security. Illiberal permanent security is driven in the name of a people, it's a particular folk, the German people, the Chinese people, the Serbian people, right? And to that extent, it's geographically delimited. But they're the ones that engage in the most extreme forms of genocide, like the Holocaust was clearly the most extreme version of illiberal permanent security. Right? Liberal permanent security, and this might bother some of you here, occurs in the name of humanity and makes the globe itself the space that needs to be securitized in the name of freedom and humanity. Now, there are different techniques on the whole between liberal and illiberal permanent security. And it's important to have this distinction, otherwise you end up making stupid and inaccurate analogies, like, the Americans are like the Nazis, which is what Jean-Paul Sartre tried to do during the Vietnam War, and it failed rhetorically because it's analytically wrong, right? The Americans, in flattening, killing 2 million North Koreans in saturation bombing and many Vietnamese civilians, were engaged in permanent security policies, but it's a different modality. Because of the Western allies had air superiority, they engaged in and invented nuclear weapons first and atomic weapons first. They gained security by bombing and killing civilians, right? But or blockades, or now drones. Okay. Now, no, drone technology is not genocide. Okay, but if your priority is protecting civilians, which is ostensibly what we all are interested in, and that's why we have the Geneva Conventions with the principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants, right? Then a global war on terror, which is in theory unending, in which We have over-the-horizon now capacities, as Biden talks about, instead of troops occupying. And you kill preemptively, usually preemptively, security threats. There's always collateral damage, i.e. civilians are killed. Now this is usually in small, obviously far smaller numbers than the genocidal imagination, but accumulates over time. You have to think in terms of the long term, right? This has been going on now for decades. And the casualties and the costs of war project at Brown University has tallied this up. I begin the book with these statistics. It's chilling, okay? If you are really interested, this is I'll finish with this. This is my challenge to those of you involved in atrocity prevention. If you are truly interested in protecting civilian life, you have to not just look at illiberal permanent security, which is so flagrant in its criminality. You also have to look at liberal permanent security if you want to have clean hands, okay? Are the Uyghurs the only people who are subject to effectively a violent occupation against international law? In the Uyghur case, not against international law, it's within the sovereign borders of China, right? But say there are other cases of long-term occupations in which people are being slowly strangled. And this is something that's effectively supported by the West, including this government, in this country, my government in Australia, Germany, all talk a big human rights game, yet undermine the ICC when it seeks to investigate. So these are the kind of, aporias in the diplomacy of humanity, of human rights, that I think need to be looked at if we're going to be truly sober in the way we protect civilian life, which is for me the moral and political imperative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moses. Let me say goodbye first, okay. Thank you so much, Professor Moses, for such a rich and thought-provoking talk, really contextualizing for us, I think, the history of the concept and the application of the term genocide against multiple geographical contexts. I don't know about some other people, but I was particularly struck by the slide on permanent security there at the end in the Chinese/Xinjiang context. And I was reminded immediately of the Chinese language term 长治久安, which means long-term control and long-term security. And this is the discourse which has been widely used since 2014, since the launch of the People's War on Terror, so-called. And I think you might have hit on something there. I'd like to open up to the floor for questions now, please, to Professor Moses. We'll do a Q&A. Thank you. Okay, we have a question from the YouTube stream from Ruslan Yusupov, our colleague, who asks, were there media campaigns by the genocidal governments at that time, Or what impact do you think the global media propaganda campaign by China today has on genocide diplomacy, and how do we deal with that?
Okay, there are two parts to that question. The historical cases I discussed, and then the situation with China today. I can't comment on the intent and the effect of the Chinese diplomatic campaign. There are other people in the room who know more about that than I do. And as I said, I'm not a sinologist, so it's best I don't comment. But it goes without saying there were intense media campaigns by the Pakistani and Nigerian governments to refute this allegation of genocide in the late 60s and early 70s. They ran a number of arguments. One, this is a security emergency, this is a civil war, and this is an internal issue which is of no concern to other states nor to the United Nations, and that they should butt out. Now, that may or may not sound very familiar to those working on the Uyghur case today, but I do see fairly consistent rhetorical strategies, and that's why, as an historian, I'm interested in seeing the continuities as well as the distinctions or ruptures between these cases. But there are these patterns in international relations in the diplomacy of genocide. So I think you can reconstruct these historically and possibly draw quite emphatic continuities to the present day.
Thank you very much. I was wondering whether, you've, I think, quite well illuminated some of the historical contradictions and issues that came to play into the definition of the UN 1948 Convention. And I was just wondering if, in formulations such as at the very first sentence, the destruction of a group as such, meaning as a group, if one can read a cultural component into the definition by virtue of the degree to which a distinct culture or language or otherwise is like a boundary marker that would be a sort of a crucial or important or whatever part of the identity of a group, so that even though a physical component is necessary or would be part of it, but the extent to which the theoretical or the conceptual idea of the reduction of the total assimilation of a group, so that via assimilation you also have the aspect of the removal of identity markers to an extent of threatening the existence of a group as a group. Thank you. You can answer this, of course. You're not a legal expert, but from the complexities of scholarship, etc.
Okay. I'll have a go. Now, there was extensive debate in the UN committees that were defining the genocide concept in 1947 and 48 about as such. Okay. There were many other formulations, and states were wondering, should we list the motivations that we should criminalize? And then it was argued, no, we shouldn't, because the ones that we don't list then will be claimed by states. They'll say, well, we're not doing it for that reason, but for other reasons, so therefore it's not genocide. So they settled on a compromise of this as such, and by then they'd removed political grounds, political groups and political motivations from the convention. So what it came to mean is, I'm afraid, nothing to do with cultural genocide, but that members of a group are killed solely on the grounds of identity. So on this non-political grounds, it becomes just a hate crime, unrelated to any sense of political agency. And it's the origins, in fact, of this artificial distinction between political and non-political crimes. So genocide gets coded as a non-political hate crime, and the archetype behind it is the Holocaust. I mean, few people used the term Holocaust at the time, but the murder of the Jews, the destruction of the Jews, Nazi persecution of the Jews. This was, people were very conscious of that by the end of the war because of the British liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the newsreels, and then the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz. It was filmed, well, at least the aftermath was filmed, and it was in the newspapers, correspondents wrote about it. So it was beginning to dawn on people by 1946, 47, that Jews had been subject to quite specific treatment, and unlike 1942, right? And that then becomes the benchmark of Nazi criminality, and the as such effectively mirrored that. They were killed just for being Jews, and genocide means that your other victims are killed just because they're members of that group. And in these debates, various modifications are made of the wording to ensure that military conflict is excluded. One representative even says, we bombed a lot of people during the war, and no doubt will, because people are already thinking of the Cold War, right? Which was certainly heating up by 1948. And we want to make sure armed conflict is even in which many civilians get killed, civilians, right? Is somehow not implicated in the Genocide Convention. So it's really down and divorced from the context in which genocides usually take place, which is armed conflict.
So the as such really pertains to the motivation or intent.
Adrian, wait for the mic. Sorry. Thank you.
Like in a seminar.
Yes, I'm being a very sneaky student here. So the as such really pertains to defining the scope of the intent as a physical focused destruction, but with the intent of destroying them because they are members of that group,
Correct.
just for their group identity.
Correct. That's how I understand it. Once again, I'm not the lawyer here, but that's how I've read the transcripts and in the jurisprudence. And as many of us, or some of us have pointed out, the international lawyers, are black letter focused and quite conservative. And they've implied a dolus specialis, the special intent, which is not in the Genocide Convention, not in those words anyway. But it's a very, very strictly read convention, which is imported into the ICC statute, and as other people have pointed out, extraordinarily difficult to prove the intent requirement in the event. And hence many prosecutions go via crimes against humanity and war crimes. But symbolically, it remains the crime of crimes, and hence the stigmatic aura that it possesses, and the almost irresistible temptation of victim groups to want to use this term to gain public attention and political intervention. And as I suggested, I completely understand this, right? But it's a kind of discursive game and trap, which is very, very difficult to win, because the analogical bar of the Holocaust is so high. And if the Holocaust is unique, as many people say, and it clearly has many distinctive features, then a fairly geographically delimited case is going to be difficult to analogize with it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. I'll come to you in a moment, Professor Packer. We have a question first in Teams from Professor Sean Roberts at George Washington University, who asks, I wonder if you could comment on the broader ways that the global war on terror has changed the diplomacy of genocide. In particular, the targeting of a loosely defined enemy, justifying the political excuse for state violence, and the fact that for the last 20 years there has been broad state agreement on the use of the war on terror to justify permanent security policies.
Well, I'd largely agree with that question, and however, it hasn't really intersected with the diplomacy of genocide per se, because no one's been alleging that the global war on terror is genocidal. It's not a concept that fits it. What I've been suggesting is that that's a problem, right? Because our optic focuses very much on the crime of crimes, looking for it, right? Which means we don't see other kinds of state criminality. And so I suggest we should replace the genocide concept or combine, let's put it this way, combine genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes and ethnic cleansing with, well, subsume it under a new concept called permanent security. Because what I'm arguing is that's actually the logic that binds them all and that drives them. And there are other kinds of state behaviors which don't fall under any of those 4 crimes anyway. So drone warfare probably can't be categorized under any of those, right? But it's clearly killing quite a lot of civilians over time, and it should be shocking the conscience of humanity, but it's not. Why not? You know, why isn't this the scandal that it should be? Now, there are the occasional opinion pieces in the press in the West which are saying maybe, you know, this is not such a great idea. But, you know, what is my observation of the way the conscience of mankind works, or is structured, you know, which is clearly not a neutral field, right, is that high-intensity violence against civilians is on people's radar. And the Uyghur case is on the edge of the radar there somewhere, right? Low-intensity violence, which is, you know, extensive over time, does not shock people's conscience because it's way below the threshold level of the language of transgression. But that kind of violence in settler colonialism, in what the Uyghurs are enduring in a much more compacted way, is elemental to state building. And so it's no accident that it's not part of the visual and other imagery that doesn't shock people in the way that other kinds do, because our whole comportment to politics and to the way states work is a legacy of state building over the centuries. So it's an epistemological argument to some extent, and you know, I'm trying to change our moral sentiments to some extent, so that we're shocked by more than just genocide, which resembles a Holocaust somewhere. We should be shocked by that. Europe was only shocked when it finally understood when it was subject to the kind of violence in a heightened way that it had been unleashing in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and the Oceania, where I come from, for centuries. Now, in saying that, I'm not equating the Holocaust with the Belgian Congo, okay? Because what a state in the 1940s, a totalitarian state in the 1940s, is capable of doing is clearly much more than a company state in Africa in the 1890s, in the 1910s, right? And yet, many millions of Congolese died, slaving away for rubber, for Western consumption. And that did shock European conscience and American conscience because of a humanitarian lobby at the time. But it took quite a lot of work. And what Uyghur activists are trying to do is shock Western consciences. And this is an old game. I mean, it's a game that you have to play. There's no choice, right? But the way the diplomacy of genocide changed the diplomacy of atrocity, if you like, in the mid-20th century, is that the threshold of what shocks the conscience of mankind has become much higher, because the Holocaust is now there as the analogical bar. And it was such an extreme event, which, you know, finally shocked Europeans about state power and colonialism within Europe, that now the bar is much higher than before, if you like. And this makes it much more difficult for groups in the post-Holocaust world to shock the conscience of mankind. So I'm arguing, in a sense, the reverse of the normal narrative. The normal narrative is that the world finally came to recognize genocide as a real thing after the Holocaust and because of the Holocaust, and that Holocaust conscience sensitizes people to criminality elsewhere. Now, I think that's true for many actors. I sense that, okay? At the same time, though, it makes drawing the dots between various crimes and provoking that shock more difficult. So it's a paradox. And I think we need to recognize that. I mean, I think it's very important for Europeans in particular to remember the Holocaust and draw lessons from it. There'll be different lessons. I mean, Britain is not a perpetrator state, but Britain didn't exactly take many refugees, did it? So, you know, and British and Australian state as well talk a big game about Holocaust memorialization. And the very same politicians say, no, we're not taking any refugees. Now, what is the purpose of that? You know, that is a distorted diplomacy of genocide.
Thanks very much. I'm very interested, and I want to ask a question directly about history. But before that, I just must say, from a legal perspective, positive law perspective, of course, the Genocide Convention is not the prevention of the Holocaust. It is the prevention of genocide, and it's actually not extraordinarily difficult to establish intent in positive law. And there's only been 2 cases at the ICJ, so it's actually more difficult against an individual because the actual standards for an individual, in fact, are more difficult. That's just to add that information. My question from historical perspective is, I'm fascinated by this distinction between identifying the Holocaust as an archetype as not political. Now, I read Mein Kampf about 40 years ago when I was 21 years old. It's overtly political, I remember hand underlining the stream of racism, the stream of German chauvinism, the first 100 pages, which is a lament about the reparations environment and so forth, and the scapegoating which comes from that, and then of course all the hierarchy that followed, and of course it wasn't just the Jews, and it was so there's definite rationale, and it is political overtly. So I don't understand how you square that as conceptually from a historical perspective, unless I'm missing it, because I don't see how anyone could say that the Holocaust was not political.
So the argument in the book, and I didn't get enough time here to promote it, obviously, is that for the Nazis, this was a political crime, and the Jews were an active, I mean, it's a delusional belief, right? But the Jews were an active political threat and needed to be neutralized, okay? Now, in an act of, violent permanent security. Now, but after the war, it gets coded in the non-political way. That's the argument, okay? So, I have a long chapter on the Holocaust where I try to show that, here's the apogee of liberal permanent security, but then that understanding is distorted after the war. Now, one of the conundrums for us is that, we need to distinguish between what the Nazis believed and reality. So the Nazis believed, the organized Jewry, world Jewry, was an active force in history and was conspiring internally within Germany and through the Allies, Roosevelt, the Russians, Soviet Jewry, to Judeo-Bolshevism to destroy Germany. Now, this is clearly a delusional belief, right? But it had a real effect. In the way they behave. So we have to carefully distinguish between those 2 scales, if you like, right? But because people couldn't attribute any reality to the Nazi intention after the war, I think they recurred to this non-political approach. Incidentally, if you read the files of the World Jewish Congress on this debate about the war crimes. In 1943 and 1944, which I reconstruct in the book, they were telling Western allies that Jews were being targeted just because they were Jews, whereas, like the World Jewish Congress quotation I adduced there, whereas the Poles and the Czechs, they're being attacked because they're partisans or for pragmatic reasons, not for ideological reasons. So that distinction is already floating around and then becomes popularized. I mean, it is understandable because, there were no, at least not until there was a reaction. I mean, there were Jewish partisans, but that was in reaction to, what the Nazis were doing. But it is an understandable belief because, there weren't that many German Jews, and in no way could they be imputed as a political enemy to Germany, however defined. And the delusional aspect confused people, I think. But there's much more to say. I would say it's all in the book. Okay. So, yeah.
So we have a question from within Teams, and the question is, the question is from Professor Ryan Thum at University of Manchester, who seems to have found somewhere outside of, within Louisiana that has power. Congratulations. And he says, what is the role of race and ethnicity? A focus on civilians as a category seems to erase the role of racism and ethno-nationalism. Is it significant that modern racism is developed during the same periods and places as the atrocity discourse? And do identity groups have a special claim to protection beyond that of individuals?
Okay, that goes to the heart of the book. I mean, the issue about the genocide concept is that it participates in the racial categorization of humanity that racists do, and kind of reiterates that in our conscience ever since. And so, quote unquote, racial, ethnic, and religious groups are privileged as a civilian category over others. You know, there are arguments that they should be, but I'm not so sure. I mean, the cover of my book is an image by a Yemeni artist, a street artist who drew a picture of a family that had died in a bombing from Saudi ordnance, no doubt supplied by Britain or America. That's where they get their weapons from. They're forgotten victims, you know, victims of bombing, and there are quite a lot of them in civil wars. Don't shock the conscience of mankind or humanity, and I want to know why. You know, why do we have this optic that some civilian deaths are less worthy or less shocking than others? Now, the reason we have a purchase on this is because the Western states, which regard themselves as civilized, to use the language of the 19th century in particular, did so on the grounds, among others, that when they engaged in warfare, they did so in a civilized way, which meant they distinguished between combatants and non-combatants, whereas the barbaric and savage peoples wouldn't. They would criminalize an entire people and wipe them out. So they were engaging in what we now call genocide, whereas we carefully distinguish between them. And this manifests itself in the principle of distinction, which is at the center of the Geneva Conventions, okay? The distinction between combatants and non-combatants. And this has become universalized into a global principle. Now, if that is now the principle of what we could like to call civilized states globally, well, then we need to take it seriously. And what I'm suggesting is that the way international law is developed with allowing proportionate killing of civilians on the grounds of military necessity, which was all defended by the Allies in the Nuremberg trials, mind you, especially when they got into a pickle about the aerial bombing, then you're countenancing in the context of a global war on terror, you know, now that warfare's become permanent rather than punctual moments, right? In a context of permanent warfare, you are countenancing the legal destruction of civilians through usually aerial bombing forever. And that's liberal permanent security. And it's not genocide, it's not the right concept, but you know, the genocide concept is a distraction to what I think, you know, one of the problems in global affairs is liberal permanent security. The other problem is illiberal permanent security. What China is doing in its borders and parts of its borders is highly problematic. It's scandalous. As you know, I'm deeply affected by the testimony I've heard from Uyghur colleagues and friends here. It's deeply upsetting. I was provoked to go on this scholarly path because I'd started out as a historian of Germany. When I got back to Australia after my PhD in the US and Germany 21 years ago by an encounter with an Indigenous friend and who I'd studied with years before. And so I ended up doing my first edited book, at least, on genocide in Australia. And you know, she got me to see things from an Indigenous perspective in Australian history. And I thought, you know, I'd never thought of that before, but I see what you're saying. And that led me on a journey to writing quite a lot about genocide and colonialism. And so, you know, when I hear these accounts of what's going on in Xinjiang, I thought, you know, that does look very familiar. But you know, if you've also studied European state formation over the last few hundred years, and you know, I do lecture on these things, then you know, it's also very similar to Russification, Polonization, all the other kinds of policies that these insecure Central European states engaged in after the First World War. You know, when the Romanov, Habsburg, and Ottoman empires collapsed, there are all these new states which have, you know, somewhat artificial borders and internal minorities which belong to the state next door. Think of Hungary and Romania, right? And they're extremely paranoid about the loyalty of those peoples. And they engage in many of the policies in their own way that we see in Xinjiang today, except the difference is you have, the Chinese state has a capacity that a weak Central European state doesn't have in terms of surveillance and military capacity. And, the scale of China also, and it's, as we've heard from some of the MPs, its economic penetration, if you like, of Western economies, means that it's very, very difficult to successfully win the diplomacy of genocide with them. So that's why I sound a somewhat pessimistic note. What I've heard in many of the papers is just in many of the presentations now. This is from Westerners, right? Not from Uyghur representatives. Is just a lot of wishful thinking. We must do this and we must do that. It's like, so when I asked the question yesterday, what are the inhibitions to doing all these things that you say we must? Well, British businesses really don't want to miss out, and we can't check our supply chains. Well, why not then pull up stumps, as you say in England, right, in Australia, and do business elsewhere? Well, they're not going to do that. Well, that means people here lose jobs, and the MP then was going to lose his election or her election. On it goes, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of clear-sighted thinking about the calculus between, or the calculation between human rights and genocide prevention, if you like, and the economic interests that and political interests. I mean, when I look at the reasoning inside the British bureaucracy for its protection of Pakistan and Nigeria during those conflicts I talked about, it was very much about the security of British citizens there, because there were British subjects in those countries, mainly owning tea plantations, for example, in Bangladesh, and oil interests and diplomats and their families, and they want them to be secure. And if they're going to squeeze those host states, well, they may not be secure. And then they have all the capital investments. They own large businesses and so forth. And so that what they want ultimately is just the end of the conflict and stability so that the economy can get going again. The calculation with China will be different because it's not a client state of the UK. Not anymore, right? Not since 1910 or something. So, and the Chinese are letting you know that. Okay. So, but the dynamic within all these bureaucracies, same with Australia, is to protect those citizens and those interests, and which belong to their citizenry, whereas the domestic civilians of the foreign state is not their citizens. So why should they owe them any obligation? Don't even vote for them. That's how they think. They won't say that in public. They'll make heartfelt statements about human rights, and we must do this, and we must do that. It all sounds good for the cameras, but it's part of the diplomacy of genocide.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Moses, and thank you to our Teams colleagues and to the YouTube audience and to the audience here. Join me in a round of applause. So I think probably each answer to each question there probably generated another set of questions, but you can ask those of Professor Moses after the close of conference. But now I'd like to invite our Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Nigel HARKNESS, to say a few words to close. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, and good evening. As Joe said, I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Newcastle University. I'm very pleased to have been able to come along at the end of this conference to, I guess, normally you come along at the beginning to welcome you. I'm coming here, I think, today to pay tribute to the work that you've been doing here, to the intellectual discussions that have been taking place. I am not going to be able to follow the challenging and thought-provoking keynote that you've just heard. So I will keep my remarks really brief. but I'm really pleased that Newcastle University has been able to offer you the connecting space to come together as a really diverse group to engage in the intellectual work that you've been doing over the last 3 days, to debate, to analyze, to challenge, to build the evidence base, to think through the issues, legal, political, legal and political, and I think really probably to hopefully move this debate forward and to probably really set out a very strong call to action at the end of this conference. I think it's really vital that universities like Newcastle are able to give you the kind of platform and space where these issues can be analysed, debated, discussed. It's really part of our lived commitment to academic freedom. I'm just going to say a few words to close, to say a huge thank you to Joe in particular, but also to the rest of the team, to Nick, who I know hasn't been able to be at the conference, but to Hannah as well as co-organisers, for bringing you all together, for bringing this diverse group of academics, politicians, lawyers, journalists, judges, and representatives from NGOs to debate, evaluate, and challenge. I think this has been a landmark contribution to Xinjiang studies. It's also been, as I said earlier, that further call to action addressed to the global community. So thanks, Joe and Nick, for your perseverance in the most difficult of circumstances. Sorry, Joe, Nick, and Hannah, for your perseverance in the most difficult of circumstances. As you know, this is a conference that got postponed twice because of COVID. So really, the tenacity needed to kind of keep going and to actually bring everyone here. We're enormously grateful to you for that work. But I want to thank everyone who's participated as well in the panels, roundtables, and debates. We're truly honored by your virtual and in-person presence for this event. So thank you very much.